Chapter 5 of Blackbeard, Buccaneer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carlos Recio. Title by Ralph D. Paine. Chapter 5. Releasing a Fearful Weapon. Jack Cockerell sprawled flat upon the forecastle roof and knew not what to do. He could lay hands on nothing to serve as a weapon, and he bade fair to be trapped like the sailors whose cause he had joined. With a feeling of despair, he let his gaze rove to the scrawny figure of Joe Hawkridge, who still bestrode the 9-pounder and took no part in the fray. But Joe had no comfort for him, as a gesture conveyed. It had been Joe's wild scheme to obtain the help of Jack and Captain Welsby, at the least, and so cast loose a gun and slew it around to rake the deck and mow the pirates down. But the men were lacking for this heavy task, and the sailors of the Plymouth Adventure were too intent on fighting against fearful odds to pay heed to Joe Hawkridge's appeals. He had even skulked into the galley, and was ready with a little iron pot filled with live coals which was hidden under a bit of tarpaulin. Ned Rackham was a young man and powerful, with a long reach and a skilled blade. He fairly hewed his way into the ruck of the dauntless sailors who had no more bricks to hurl. Several pirates were disabled, with broken arms or bloody crowns, but the others crowded forward, grunting as they slashed and stabbed, and well aware that Ned Rackham would cut the laggards down should he detect them. At the moment when there seemed no chance of salvation for the crew of the Plymouth Adventure, Joe Hawkridge leaped from the gun and beckoned Jack. The grin was restored to the homely freckled visage, and the salt-water gamin danced in jubilant excitement. Down from the forecastle roof tumbled Jack Cockerell and went sliding across the deck, heels over head, to fetch up in the scupper. Joe hauled him by the leg, close to the wooden carriage of the gun, and swiftly told him what was to be done. Obediently Jack began to loose the knots which secured the rope tackles, but it was a slow task. The wet had made the hemp as hard as iron, and he lacked a marline spike. Joe dodged around the gun, saw the difficulty, and sawed through one rope after another, all but the last strand or two. Then the lads tailed on to the breeching hawsers, which held the carriage from sliding on its iron rollers, and eased the strain as well as they could. The ponderous mass was almost free to plunge across the deck. Joe sweated and braced his feet against a ring bolt, while Jack Cockerell found a cleat. Ned Rackham's men were moving forward, cut and thrust, while the sailors grappled with them bare-handed, and battled grimly like mastiffs. "The next time she rolls," panted Joe Hawkridge, as the hawser ripped the skin from his palms. "Aye, make ready to cut," muttered Jack. The ship heaved herself high, and then listed far down to starboard. Joe slashed at the last strands of the tackles, and yelled to Jack to let go the hawser. Instead of discharging the 9-pounder, they were employing the piece itself, and the carriage of oak and iron, as a terrible missile. The moment of launching it was shrewdly chosen. The pirates, still in compact formation as led by Ned Rackham, were directly abreast of this forward gun of the Maine Battery. The deck inclined at a steep and giddy pitch. With a grinding roar, the gun rolled from its station. It gathered impetus and lunged across the ship as an instrument of fell destruction. It was more to be feared than an assault of armed men. The warning rumble of the iron wheels as they furrowed the planking was heard by the pirates. They turned from their game of butchery and stood frozen in their tracks for a frightened instant. Then they tried to flee in all directions. Their tarry pigtails fairly stood on end, while they knew what it meant to have a gun break adrift in a heavy sea. 2 or 3 who had been badly hurt were unable to move fast enough. The gun crunched over them, and then seemed to pursue a limping pirate, fearing to overtake him as he fled. He was tossed against the bulwark like a bundle of bloody rags. The gun crashed into the stout timbers of the ship's side, and they were splintered like matchwood. It rebounded as the deck sloped sharply in the next wallowing roll, and now this frenzied monster of wood and iron seemed fairly to run amok. It was inspired with a sinister intelligence, resolved to wreak all the damage possible. The pinnace, the water barrels, the coamings of the cargo hatches were smashed to fragments as the gun turned this way and that and went plunging in search of victims. Left to themselves, the seamen of the Plymouth Adventure would have risked their lives to cast ropes about the gun and moor it fast, but now they were quick to see that the tide had been turned in their favor. The pirates were demoralized. Some were in the rigging, others atop the bulwarks, and only the readiest and boldest, with Ned Rackham in the lead, had an eye to the task in hand, which was to regain possession of the ship. And now the boatswain of the Plymouth Adventure, a rosy giant of a man from South Devon, shouted to his comrades to follow him. They delayed until the runaway cannon crashed into another gun, and then they broke like sprinters from the mark, and sped straight for the mainmast, seeking the rack of boarding pikes. They ran nimbly, as men used to swaying decks, and compassed a distance in a few strides. Ned Rackham perceived their purpose and tried to intercept, but his few staunch followers moved warily, expecting to see that insensate monster of a gun bear down upon them. The swiftest of the merchant sailors laid hands on the pikes and whirled to cover their shipmates until all hands could be armed. Then the gun came roaring down at them, but they ducked behind the mast or stepped watchfully aside. Men condemned to death are not apt to lose their wits in the face of one more peril. These pikes were ashen shafts with long steel points, and the merchant seamen had been trained to use them. And the brawn of these lads made the pike a match for a pirate's cutlass. Ned Rackham bounded forward to swing at the broad, deep-chested boatswain. A wondrous pair of antagonists they were, in the prime of their youth and vigor. The pirate's cutlass bit clean through the pike shaft as the boatswain parried the blow, but the apple-cheeked Devonshire man closed in and wrapped his arms around his foe. They went to the deck, clutching for each other's throats, and the fight trampled over them. Meanwhile, Joe Hawkridge and Jack Cockrell, unwilling to twiddle their thumbs, had rushed aft as fast as their legs could carry them. It was a mutual impulse to release such of the men passengers as might have a stomach for fighting, and also the ship's officers. Into the doorway, which led from the waist, the two lads dived and scurried through the main cabin, now clear of pirates. Locked doors they smashed with a broad axe found in the small arms chest, and so entered all the rooms. The women passengers were almost dead with suffering, what with the turbulence of the storm and the wild riot on deck. The lads pitied them, but had no time to console. Several of the men, merchants and planters of some physical hardihood, begged for weapons, and Joe Hawkridge bade them help themselves from the spare arms which the pirates had left in the great cabin. In another little room the boys found the mates, steward, surgeon, and gunner of the Plymouth Adventure, and you may be sure that they came boiling out with a raging thirst for strife. "Harkee, Jack," said Joe before they climbed to the poop deck. "If the pirates are driven aft, as I expect, they will make a last stand in this cabin house, which is like a fort. These defenseless women must be hidden safe from harm. Do you coax them into the lazarette?" This was a room on the deck below, in the very stern of the ship, where were kept the extra sails and coils of rope and various stores. It was the surest shelter against harm in such stress as this. Alas, Jack's persuasions were vain. The frantic women were in no humor to listen, and so the lads bundled them through the hatch as gently as possible, and for company gave them such male passengers as lacked strength or courage to join the battle. While they were thus engaged, two pirates came flying down the ladder from the poop deck into the main cabin. They revolved like windmills in a jumble of arms and legs. Close behind them, in a manner more orderly, came Captain Jonathan Welsby, who had tossed the one and tremendously booted the other. They were the helmsmen, whom he had replaced with his own officers at the steering tackles, while his first mate had been left in charge of handling the ship. The skipper was now free to follow his own desires, and he fell upon those two stunned pirates in the cabin, and trussed them tight with bits of rope. Then he reloaded with dry powder all the pistols he could find, and made a walking arsenal of himself. The two lads who now joined him needed no word of command. At his heels they made for the main deck, and the shout which arose from those British sailors, so sorely beset, was mightily heartening. Blazing away with his pistols, the skipper cleared a path for himself, the pirates being taken aback when they were attacked in the rear. And they were leaderless, for Ned Rackham had been dragged aside with the marks of the boatswain's fingers on his throat and a sheath knife buried in his side. He was alive, but nobody paid heed to his groans. With the skipper in the thick of it, there was no danger of being penned in the forecastle again. The pirates were crowded aft, step by step, before the play of those wicked boarding pikes. It would be hard to match a sea fight like this, amid the spray and the washing seas, on a deck that tipsily danced and staggered, with a truant gun smashing a good ship to bits and the wounded screaming as they saw this horror thundering at them. Captain Welsby's men were at pains to drag their helpless comrades to safety, but the pirates were too callous and too hard-pressed to care for aught save their own worthless skins. They fought like wolves, but they lacked the gristle and endurance of the stalwart sailors. Wheezing for breath, they ceased to curse and reeled back in silence while the sailors huzzaed and seemed to wax the lustier. As was bound to happen, the stubborn retreat broke into a rout. It was every man for himself, and the devil take the hindmost. The pirates fled for the after cabin house, there to take cover behind the timbered walls and use the small portholes for musketry fire. Thus they could find respite, and it would be immensely difficult to dislodge them. The first mate of the Plymouth Adventure and his own 2 helmsmen saw what was taking place, and they were of no mind to be cut off at the stern of the ship. They footed it along the poop and the cabin roof as the pirates were scampering inside, and so gained the waist and were with their comrades. The tiller deserted, the vessel careened into the trough of the sea with a portentous creaking of spars and rending of canvas. The mainmast had been dealt more than one splintering blow by the fugitive gun. This sudden strain of a ship broached to and hurled almost on her beam ends was too much for the damaged mast. It broke short off, a few feet above the deck, and the ragged butt ripped the planks asunder as it was dragged overside by the weight of the towering fabric of yards and canvas. One merciful circumstance befell, for the tangle of shrouds and sheets and halyards ensnared the ramping monster of a cannon and overturned it. Caught in this manner, the gun was dragged to the broken bulwark, and there was held with a battered carronade. The mainmast was floating alongside the ship, which had belabored with thumps that jarred the hull. It was likely to stave in the skin of the vessel, and Captain Welsby shouted to his men to hack at the trailing cordage and send the mast clear before it did a fatal injury. A dozen men risked drowning at this task, while the others guarded the after cabin, lest the pirates attempt a sally. These besieged rogues were given an interval in which to muster their force, organize a defense, and break into the magazine for muskets and powder and ball. Now Captain Welsby was no dullard, and he purposed to make short work of these vile pirates. Otherwise, his crippled ship might not survive the wind and weather. He conferred with his gunner, who had bethought himself, by force of habit, to fetch from aft his powder horn and several yards of match, or twisted tow, which were wrapped around his body beneath a tarred jerkin. "It grieves me sore to wreck yonder goodly cabin house," said the skipper in his beard, "but by Judas, we'll blow him out of it. Haul and belay your pieces, master gunner, and let him have a salvo of a round shot." Reckless of the musket balls which began to fly among them, the sailors jumped for their stations at the guns. First they set aright that capsized 9-pounder which had wreaked so much mischief, and found that it could be discharged, despite the broken carriage. Joe Hawkridge and Jack Cockrell blithely aided to swing and secured with emergency tackles, and Joe exclaimed with a chuckle, "This dose is enough to surprise Blackbeard himself. 'Tis an ironmonger's shop I rammed down its throat." The gun was laid on the largest cabin porthole, just as it framed the ugly face of a pirate with a musket, while another peered over his shoulder. Joe shook the powder horn into the touch-hole, and the gunner was ready with the match which he had lighted with his own flint and steel. Boom, and the gun recoiled in a veil of smoke. Through the cabin porthole flew a deadly shower of spikes and bolts, while the framework around it was shattered to bits. It was a most unhealthy place for pirates. They forsook it instantly. And the musketry fire slackened elsewhere. It was to be inferred that there was painful consternation in the cabin. With boisterous mirth, the sailors deftly turned other guns to bear, and were careful not to let them get adrift. The muzzles had been well stopped against wetting by the sea, and with a little dry powder for the priming, most of them could be served. They could not be reloaded for dearth of ammunition, but Captain Welsby felt confident that one round would suffice. Methodically the gun crews aimed and fired one gun after another, watching the chance between the seas that broke aboard. The solid round shot, at short range, ripped through the cabin walls and bulkheads, and buried themselves in the frames and timbers of the ship's stern. A good gunner was never so happy as when he saw the white splinters fly in showers, and these zealous sailormen forgot they were knocking their own ship to pieces. They were on the target, and this was good enough. The beleaguered pirates made no more pretense of firing muskets or defying the crew to dig them out. Their fort was an untenable position. At this sport of playing bowls, with round shot, they were bound to lose. Captain Welsby sighted the last gun himself. It was a bronze culverin of large bore, taken as a trophy from the stranded wreck of a Spanish galleon. With a tremendous blast, this formidable cannon spat out a double-shotted load, and the supports of the cabin roof were torn asunder. The tottering beams collapsed. Half the structure fell in. It was a signal for the sailors of the Plymouth Adventure to charge aft and finish the business. They found pirates crawling from under the wreckage. It was like a demolished ant-heap. In the smaller cabins and other rooms far aft, which were more or less intact, some of the rascals showed fight, but they were remorselessly prodded out with pikes, and those unwounded were hustled forward to be thrown into the forecastle. It was difficult to restrain the seamen from dealing them the death they deserved, but Captain Welsby was no sea butcher. and he hoped to turn them over to the colonial authorities to be hanged with due ceremony. The badly hurt were laid in the forecastle bunks, where the ship's surgeon washed and bandaged them after he had cared for the injured men of his own crew. Ned Rackham was still alive, conscious and defiant, surviving a wound which would have been mortal in most cases. Whether he lived or died was a matter of small concern to Captain Welsby, but he ordered the surgeon to nurse him with special care. The dead pirates were flung overboard, but the bodies of 7 brave British seamen were wrapped in sailcloth to be committed to the deep on the morrow, with a round shot at their feet and a prayer to speed their souls. There were men enough to work on the ship, but she was in a situation indescribably forlorn. It was possible to patch and shore the cabin house and make a refuge, even to find place for the wretched women who were lifted unharmed out of the lazarette. But the stout ship, her mainmast gone by the board, the deck ravaged by that infernal catapult of an errant gun, the hull pounded by the floating wreckage of spars, would achieve a miracle should she see port again. The combat with the pirates and their overthrow had been waged in the last hour before the grey night closed over a sombre sea. God's mercy had caused the wind to fall and the waves to diminish in size, else the ship would have gone to the bottom ere dawn. Much water had washed down into the hold through the broken cargo hatch and the gaps where the runaway gun had torn other fittings away. The carpenter sounded the well and solemnly stared at the wetted rod by the flicker of his horn lantern. The ship was settling. It was his doleful surmise that she leaked where the pounding spars overside had started the butts. It was man the pumps to keep the old hooker afloat, and Captain Welsby ordered his weary men to sway at the brakes, watch and watch. Joe Hawkridge and Jack Cockerell, more fit for duty than the others, put their backs into it right heartily, while the sailors droned to the cadence of the pump a sentimental ditty, which ran on for any number of verses and began in this wise. As lately I travelled toward Gravesend, I heard a fair damsel a seaman commend, and as in a tilt boat we passed along, in praise of brave seamen she sung this new song: Come tradesman or merchant, whoever he be, there's none but a seaman shall marry with me. Thus they laboured all the night through, men near dead with fatigue, whose hard fate it was to contend now with pirates and again with a hostile ocean. The skipper managed to stave the foremast and to bend steering sails so that the ship was brought into the wind where her motion was easier. The sky cleared before daybreak, and the rosy horizon proclaimed a fair sunrise. How far and in what direction the Plymouth Adventure had been blown by the storm was largely guesswork. By means of dead reckoning and the compass and cross-staff, Captain Welsby hoped to work out a position, but meanwhile he scanned the sea with a sense of brooding anxiety. Instead of praying for plenty of sea room, he now hoped with all his heart that the vessel had been set in toward the coast. She was sinking under his feet and would not live through the day. It was useless to toil at the pumps or to strive at mending the shattered upperworks. The men turned to the task of quitting the ship and of saving the souls on board. It was a pitiful extremity, and yet they displayed a dogged, unshaken fidelity. Only one boat had escaped destruction. The pinnace had been staved in by the thunderbolt of a gun in the yawl, stowed upon the cabin roof, was wrecked by a round shot. The small jolly boat would hold the women passengers and the wounded sailors, with the hands required to tend oars and sail. Nothing remained but to try to knock together one or more rafts. Captain Welsby discussed it with his officers, and it was agreed that the able-bodied pirates should be left to build a raft for themselves, taking their own wounded with them. This was more mercy than they had any right to expect. The strapping young Devonshire boatswain, with his head tied up, was for leaving the backguards to drown in the forecastle, but the shipmaster was too humane a man for that. It was drawing toward noon when the first mate descried land to the westward, a bit of low coast almost level with the sea. In the light air the sluggish ship moved ever so slowly, with canvas spread on the fore and mizzen masts. Spirits revived and life tasted passing sweet. To drift in the open sea upon wave-washed rafts was an expedient which all mariners shuddered to contemplate. It was with feelings far different that they now assembled spars and planks and lashed and spiked them together on the chance of needing rafts to ferry them ashore from a stranded ship. Well into the bright afternoon, the Plymouth Adventure was wafted nearer and nearer the sandy coast. Within a half-mile of it, a line of breakers frothed and tumbled on a shoal beyond which the water deepened again. The ship could not be steered to avoid this barrier. Her main deck was almost level with the sea, which lapped her gently and sobbed through the broken bulwarks. With a slight shock, she struck the shoal and rested there just before she was ready to founder. With disciplined haste, the jolly boat was launched and filled with its human freightage. The boatswain went in charge, and 4 seamen tugged at the sweeps. There were trees and clumps of bushes among the hillocks of sand, and a tiny bight for a landing place. The bulwark was then chopped away so that the largest raft could be shoved into the water by means of tackles, rollers, and handspikes. It floated buoyantly and supported as many as 15 men, who did not mind in the least getting their feet wet. Upon a raised platform in the center of the raft were fastened barrels of beef and bread and casks of fresh water. The jolly boat could hope to make other trips between the ship and the shore, but the prudent skipper took no chances with the weather. A sudden gale might pluck the Plymouth Adventure from the shoal or tear her to fragments where she lay. Therefore, most of the men, including passengers, were embarked on the raft. Captain Welsby remained aboard with a few of his sailors and our 2 lads, Joe and Jack, who had not attempted to thrust themselves upon the crowded raft. The pirates were making a commotion in the forecastle, yammering to be freed, but the skipper had no intention of losing them until all his people had safely abandoned ship. The jolly boat made a landing without mishap and returned to the wreck as the sun went down. More stores were dumped into it, sacks of potatoes and onions which had been overlooked, bedding for the women, powder and ball for the muskets, and other things which it was necessary to keep dry. Captain Welsby got rid of the rest of his men on this trip, excepting the gunner and carpenter, and these lingered with him as a kind of bodyguard pending the ticklish business of releasing the imprisoned pirates and forsaking them to their own devices. The jolly boat was laid into the gunwales, and Jack Cockerell held back, saying to Joe Hawkridge, "Why trouble the captain to set us ashore? Let us make a raft of our own. The breeze holds fair to the beach, and it will be a lark." "It suits me well," grinned Joe. "If we wait to go off with the master, and those sinful pirates see me aboard, I'll need wings to escape them. They saw me serve the gun that was filled with spikes to the muzzle. Aye, Jack, I will feel happier to be elsewhere when Captain Welsby unbars the forecastle and holds him back with his pistols till he can cast off in the jolly boat." "Yes, the sight of you is apt to put them in a vile temper," laughingly agreed Jack, "and 'tis awkward for the master to bother with us. Now, about a little raft. 2 short spars are enough, there they lie, and the cabin hatch will do for a deck. Spikes for thole pins and oars for the pinnace, and lace the bonnet of the jib for a sail. You're a proper sailor man, Joe. A voyage by starlight to an unknown coast, 'tis highly romantic." They set to work without delay. Captain Welsby had occupations of his own, and no more than glanced at them in passing. Jack insisted on carrying a water breaker and rations, he being hungry and too busy to pause for supper. They would make a picnic cruise of the adventure. Handily Joe reeved a purchase, and they hauled away until their raft slid off the sloping deck to leeward. With a gay hurrah to Captain Welsby, they paddled around the stern of the ship and through the ruffle of surf that marked the shoal. In the soft twilight they trimmed the sail and swung at the clumsy oars, while a fire blazing on the beach was a beacon to guide their course. After a time they rested and wiped the sweat from their faces. The progress of the raft was like that of a lazy snail. In the luminous darkness they pulled with all their strength. The wind had died to a calm. The sail hung idle from its yard. They heard, faint and afar, the deep voices of the sailors in the jolly boat as they returned to take the skipper and his 2 companions from the ship on which a light burned. The lads shouted, but there came no answering hail from the unseen boat. They were perplexed to understand how their courses could be so far apart. Presently the night breeze drew off the land, bringing with it the scent of green things growing. Joe Hawkridge stared at the fire on the beach, and then turned to look at the spark of light on the ship. The raft had drifted considerably to the southward. Anxiously Joe said to his shipmate, "The flood of the tide must be setting us down the coast in some crazy current or other. Mayhap it runs strong through this race betwixt the shoal and the beach, with a slant that's bad for us." "I noted it," gloomily agreed Jack. "The jolly boat passed too far away to please me, and this landward breeze is driving us to sea." "No sense in breaking our backs at these oars," grumbled Joe. "We go ahead like a crab, with a stern board. Think ye we can swing the raft to fetch the ship?" "After Captain Welsby turns the pirates loose and quits her?" scoffed Jack. "I am a plaguey fool," cheerfully admitted Joe Hawkridge. "'Twould be out of the frying pan into the fire with a vengeance." "And no way to signal our friends," sadly exclaimed Jack. "We forgot flint and steel. It looks much like another voyage." "Straight for the open sea, my bully boy," agreed Joe. "And I'd as soon chance it on a hen coop." End of Chapter 5.